Thank you for that. And now our last guest, Carla Brooks, who is licensed to practice in Minnesota and in California, happily. Carla Brooks represents clients across the globe who have been having legal needs involving immigration, be they civil rights cases or criminal defense cases. At the outset of the pandemic, he was able to convince the Honorable Terry Hatter, a district court in Los Angeles, I believe still, the federal court, to release his client who was detained in Adelanto Detention Center over strenuous government objections. Nevertheless, Mr. Brooks got him out. He needed to get him out due to the risk of COVID-19. Well, Carlo Brooks, welcome to the Lawyers Guild show. I want to start you off this way. Trump used to always talk about the folks at the border, the U.S.-Mexican border, they're drug dealers, rapists, terrorists. He famously once time referred to them as, bad hombres. And, well, Trump's out of office, but the bad hombre trope continues. Just recently, in fact, I think it was Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy publicly stated that the migrants are on the terrorist watch list from Yemen and Iran and Turkey, he says, and they're at our border, although I don't think he's produced one single bit of evidence to support such a claim. But you've represented non-citizens in both criminal and immigration proceedings. How does the bad hombre stereotype compare with the actual facts about your clients and who we're talking about?
Right, Jim. Thank you. That's an excellent question, and thank you for having me on the program. I'm a KPFK listener. Happy to be on the airwaves. Unfortunately, the public discourse on immigration has been plagued by this notion of the quote-unquote criminal alien for many years now, but especially starting in the 1980s, which coincides with the so-called war on drugs. And what I'd like your listeners to understand is that these are not separate and distinct issues. When we talk about criminal justice reform, immigration law, too, is plagued with this pervasive notion of criminality. Now, I believe that many people, at least many people who are more or less on the left side of the political spectrum, know that immigration laws themselves are not criminal statutes. And when you listen to mainstream media, it sometimes explains that crossing the border is actually not a crime. There is one specific crime which deals with reentry after deportation, which is a federal crime, not a very serious one, by the way. But I believe it's important to take it a step farther and understand that, number one, the clients that I represent are not the people that you and your neighbors should be concerned about. First of all, most of them have no criminal history whatsoever. And of the ones that do, which it's true is a specialty of mine and something that I happened into, because as Maria pointed out earlier, this is not a focus in law school whatsoever. And, you know, I have to thank First Law Office in Canoga Park for hiring me straight out of law school and throwing me into this incredibly complex and challenging, but very stimulating area of the law. In immigration law, any type of quote-unquote rap sheet, any criminal history whatsoever is inordinately punitive. And this began sometime in the 1980s when the term aggravated felony went from denoting murderers, major drug traffickers, and major firearms traffickers to eventually designating just about anything, okay?
Right.
Including including, excuse me, criminal offenses which outside of the immigration world would pose no particular issue for the citizen. These would be things that which could be quote unquote expunged and wiped from one's record for employment purposes and things like that. Not so in the immigration world. And so somebody who was living in South Los Angeles and who made the dumb mistake in 1993 of having been caught with 15 grams of rock cocaine on them, which, by the way, they may or may not have had, because we know the excesses of the police during that era. This will follow them for life and will cause extreme hardship not only to them, but to their entire U.S. citizen family.
Yes.
And the laws are almost entirely unforgiving in this respect. So many of my clients find themselves caught in this dragnet because of very distant criminal history, things they may not even remember, things which a citizen would have wiped away years ago with a simple expungement. They can find themselves in a detention center in the middle of the high desert in San Bernardino County, with sometimes, to add insult to injury, no cognizable form of relief because of the way the laws are structured. And so I think that's what people need to understand when they hear things like bad hombre, criminal alien, etc. Immigration lawyers are not people who champion lawlessness. We are people who are very dedicated to the Constitution and to traditional notions of fair play and justice as set forth in the Magna Carta, for example.
Well, I wonder, I think it'd be interesting for our listeners, you're right, because this has, of course, all been done for not only by Trump, but McCarthy, but for others for political purposes. You know, make these immigrants look as though they're the scum of the earth, make them look as though they somehow must be guilty of something. You know, otherwise they wouldn't be fleeing their homeland, right? That's what everybody wants to do, is flee their homeland across 10,000 miles of desert and brush. You know, but that's what happens. And there's, you know, the good immigrant, the bad immigrant, all that kind of stuff. But they use it for political purposes, and it affects what you, as you said, it affects how it, when you're doing your work in a courtroom to prevent a deportation of someone, or and otherwise. I wonder if you could give us an example, for example, of where you were able, happily, but to overcome a lower court's bad decision when you appealed the case, that would educate us a bit about this.
Okay, yes, and that's an excellent question, because it illustrates just how difficult this can be. So to focus on controlled substance violations, which are extremely, in my view, over-penalized in the Immigration Nationality Act regulations and the agency's policy, there is virtually no form of relief and no exception, no waiver for any type of controlled substance violation, save for a couple of slim exceptions, and which do not apply to everybody. But I'm talking about, for example, first-time possession of marijuana under 30 grams, for example. Aside from that, if indeed there is a conviction on the record showing that the person was convicted of a controlled substance violation, essentially on appeal, the only mechanism we have for fighting that is to make a very sophisticated, what's called a Taylor argument. It comes from a Supreme Court case called Taylor v. U.S., in which we must show that the crime of which they were convicted, which is typically a state law crime, and by the way, that's something that people should become aware of is that each state has its own laws, and so something that makes an immigrant ineligible for relief because of a conviction, say in Arizona, may not make them ineligible in California, or vice versa. We need to argue that it does not correspond to the federal analog. And for anybody who's interested, they can go to the Ninth Circuit immigration outline and look at some of the famous cases in which the court has gone into a very deep Taylor analysis. Aside from that, if we cannot make that argument, and this is something which I do frequently, we need to go back to the criminal court and seek to vacate this conviction. Because 9 times out of 10, when the person pled no contest or guilty to this particular crime, they were not aware of the gargantuan immigration consequences that it would have on their life, and that's
may or may not have had a lawyer's advice at the time, right?
Well, if they were in criminal court, then they most likely
if it was a felony, yeah.
Because the nice thing about criminal court is that, in theory at least, the defendant is entitled to the full panoply of due process protection. Not in immigration,
No,
due process light, as your previous guest pointed out. No lawyers for children, for example.
Yeah.
How does that comport with due process?
And then
in any event,
a lot of times.
so,
Oh, sorry, Carlo. I was
sorry,
just
go
going to
ahead,
add,
Maria.
and I know it also it took a while for criminal defense lawyers to come up to speed and realize that, oh wow, this, for example, a plea bargain might have really terrible consequences for immigration. Is that right?
Right, and it's something that's been developing over the years. Most public defender offices now have their own dedicated, quote unquote, crimmigration attorney to help advise on pleas. And one open question that we have is what the new DA, George Gascon's plan is in this respect. Is he planning to sort of hire attorneys who are specialized in immigration law? Is he going to hire consultants? Because the best way to deal with these issues is to catch them before a plea and not afterward, in which case we need to marshal quite a bit of evidence to show what the circumstances are when the plea was entered. So to answer your question, I think that I truly believe, at least I hope, that if the general public was aware of the complexity of this system and just how difficult it is to navigate around it to the point where you need an attorney who is specialized in this arcane, body of law.
Yeah, and I suspect that most of our listeners, are not having had their minds warped by law school, I mean, they're just good folks, don't understand that because of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, where it uses the term aliens, I mean, undocumented immigrants in their country, no matter what their situation may be, are entitled to due process. The right to attorney, the right to adequate representation, the right to a fair hearing in court, the right to confront witnesses against them, the right to see the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. They're entitled basically to the same rights in those situations that the rest of us are, and they're not getting it. They're either having no legal advice at all, or they're getting it from an attorney who's got 8,000 other cases, doesn't know what the implications are, as you pointed out, of immigration law, on the plea that the man or woman is taking to some crime which is not the crime of the century, and on it goes. And that's what you're up against on a daily basis in the work that you do, is it not?
Yes, and I'm so glad that you make that point. I do think that there is sometimes confusion about that, but because these individuals are on U.S. soil, they are
Hmm.
entitled to the protections of the U.S. Constitution. In order to understand the inverse of that, understand why the government um, extracted individuals and put them in Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah,
That was to remove them from the protections of, of the Constitution.
good
But
point.
there's a seminal Supreme Court case called Zavidas v. U.S., which says that even the quote unquote alien um, awaiting deportation in a detention center is entitled to due process and cannot be
Absolutely.
kept in detention indefinitely. The problem is that immigration proceedings are, at least nominatively, civil proceedings, and therefore the government has decided that the respondents are not entitled to representation at the government's expense as they are in criminal court. These things can change. I hope that they will. There's a push to reform the immigration courts, to make them full-fledged, what's sometimes called Article 1 courts, as opposed to courts which are directly under the Attorney General. And I believe that would help immensely.
You
Um,
you
I
mentioned
think
one of your
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, I was just saying that one of your clients, as I recall, it was getting them out, and you had to go through the whole appellate process, the federal system to do it. I mean, well, not the whole process, but you had to appeal, and that was because of the COVID epidemic. And in Adelanto, which is a big immigration detention center here in California, um, I, what is the current status of that? I mean, isn't Adelanto still filled with a lot of detainees and still having a high rate of COVID-19s? What's going on, and what effort is being made to correct that bit of inhumane treatment?
Well, that's a good question. Fortunately, I was actually able to get all of my clients out of Adelanto during the pandemic. It was my primary focus, in fact, and it was a long, arduous process. I have to, the ACLU deserves an enormous amount of credit for
Indeed,
that.
indeed.
They broke the ground with the first petition for habeas corpus, which eventually evolved into class action lawsuits. Some of my clients were involved in the original habeas lawsuits. The rest of them were eventually all class members in the class action lawsuits. But to your point, because of the way ICE, what's the word I can use, unreasonably, we'll put it diplomatically, advocate for detention based on this notion that the quote unquote alien is a danger to the community, and in fact inflates the criminal history that they may have, and in fact includes outright errors. People like myself need to go line by line in the FBI reports and point out all of the errors that the agency makes in its assertions. If those are not corrected, how will the judge know that
Yes, right.
this person was actually not convicted of this crime? And so it is, it's always a hard battle. I know that many people remain in Adelanto, and the only, as far as I'm aware, unfortunately, their best shot for relief at the time is for case review under the executive's new enforcement priorities. There is a new process for that. Based on my experience and some of my colleagues' experiences, that process is not fantastic. I hope that the results of it make it up to the top of the executive so that they understand where some house cleaning may have to be done in order.
Yeah. That's what I've been getting at other times during the show, which is so damn frustrating to me, and I know it is to Maria. We've talked about this. I mean, all of you. Daniel and Margaret and yourself. I mean, you're doing imaginative, creative. I'm sorry, I believe it, heroic legal work. I mean, I practiced law for a lot of years and did a lot of strange stuff, and so I know what you're going through, and it's not easy. And for the government to put in your way not reasonable but unreasonable and dishonest reasons, and to deny the due process that is denied on a daily basis. If I could make you in charge of the whole, we don't have a lot of time left, just a couple minutes, but what would you do? What would be one or two things that you would do? Would you simply have more judges and more time for each case? Would you have law schools train more lawyers? Would you have the government provide a lawyer for everybody, even in immigration court? I mean, what were some of the things? What would you do to try to stop this system so that it isn't just folks like Carlo and Daniel and Margaret and others beating and having to push this rock up the mountain every day? What would you do to level the playing field?
Well, we certainly need immigration reform. The Immigration and Nationality Act is a mess. People talk about the tax code being a mess,
Yep.
but they should see this. And this doesn't result in an audit, right? This results in families being torn apart, people being deported, people dying in detention. So it's not easy, but that would be number one. Number two would be a reform of the immigration court system. It needs to be an independent court system. We can't have judges who are appointed by the Attorney General. It seems to me there's just an inherent conflict of interest.
Absolutely.
There. And I think we need a review of every agency action over the last at least 4 years, and a serious cleanup. And I believe that may even be easier to do than immigration reform, and the impact would be immense.
Yeah. At the very least, in other words, have a court system that resembles the kind of court system we claim to offer everyone in this country, so that at least, forgetting what's going on at the border, forgetting all the other terrible things, at least if somebody found themselves either being deported or in some other way in jeopardy as an immigrant in this country, they wouldn't be hoping and out of luck in a lot of cases if they don't happen to find you and Margaret and Daniel. That would be something. Where are we at? I think we only have a minute or so left. Am I right, D'Angelo, or we've got a lot of announcements today, or what? I hear some music starting to play, so I just have time to thank you, Carlo.
Can I give, thank you, Carlo. Can I give also Margaret asked if we could give the full names of the websites that she had listed earlier for help. One is ayudainfo.org. That's AYUDA info.org. And another is the Rapid Response Network in San Diego, which is Rapid Response, SD.org.
All right.
/CAWTF.
And I promised Frank Durrell, and I almost missed it. Don't forget this Sunday, folks, starting at 1 o'clock, this amazing webinar on the Cold War with all sorts of people you'd like to hear from. Well, you'll hear from me even if you don't want to, but there's all sorts of other people on it. Great activists in our country. It starts at 1 o'clock on the Cold War. It's a webinar. Nothing ever been held quite like it out this Sunday starting at 1 o'clock. Frank Durrell has been sending all the news you have around it. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to you for listening. This is Jim Lafferty on behalf of myself and Maria Hall, urging you to stay healthy. Join us again next week. And meanwhile, stand up for your rights, my friends.
Great God will come from the sky, take away everything and make everybody feel high. But if you know what life is worth, you would look for yours.
You know, maybe $75 is the right amount for you to give to KPFK. That $75 comes out to exactly 21 cents a day, and that pays for a lot of programming on KPFK. Hours of intelligent news every day on Democracy Now! And the Background Briefing with Ian Masters, local news, local politics and culture from Sojourner Truth with Margaret Prescott, entertaining, thoughtful shows like The Global Village, The Car Show, and Pacifica Performance Showcase. Your support makes them all possible, which is why KPFK needs your contribution right now. Tom Hartman here, reminding you that your contribution of $75 helps pay for programs that make KPFK a unique and essential part of life in Southern California. Give online at